Like everyone's always complaining about inflation these days, right? Everything's getting so expensive.
Yeah, totally.
And, tariffs are definitely a part of that story. And President Trump's latest tariff decisions on Mexico and Canada,
Oh, yeah?
those have been causing quite a stir lately. We're going to do a deep dive into all of that and really try to, figure out what's actually going on.
It's interesting because this isn't just like an economic story.
Right.
It's also about politics. It's about international relations. It's even like a bit of a power struggle between these leaders.
Totally. It's like a high-stakes game with potentially huge consequences. We've got tons of sources for this, articles, reports, even some pretty heated discussions on Reddit.
Oh, wow.
And we're going to break it all down for you today.
All right, so we'll look at like why these tariffs were imposed in the first place, how Canada and Mexico are fighting back, and what this might mean for your wallet.
Yeah, exactly. So, let's start by setting the scene.
Okay.
We're in the world of the USMCA, that trade agreement that replaced NAFTA. And the whole idea was to, simplify trade between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
Yeah.
But then President Trump kind of throws a wrench in the works, right? By suddenly slapping these tariffs on both Mexico and Canada.
He cited fentanyl smuggling and border security as the reasons, which is interesting because, those issues weren't really central to the USMCA negotiations.
Right. It felt like a curveball.
Yeah.
And the stock market definitely took a hit. Anyone who's invested probably felt that dip in their retirement savings.
Yeah.
It just sent this wave of uncertainty through the markets and had economists really worried about a potential trade war.
Yeah, the initial tariffs were pretty steep. It was 25% on a range of goods coming from Mexico and Canada.
Wow.
So, imagine you're a business owner who relies on importing certain materials or parts from these countries. Suddenly, all your costs go up. And it becomes really difficult to plan for the future. I mean, do you raise prices? Do you cut back on hiring?
Right.
It puts these businesses in a real bind.
It's like the rug got pulled out from under them, and then things got even crazier when Trump, abruptly hit the pause button on these tariffs.
Oh, wow.
Granting temporary exemptions, especially for auto-related imports.
But this pause didn't really solve the problem, though.
Right.
The threat of tariffs still loomed large,
Yeah.
Because Trump announced plans to impose reciprocal tariffs in the near future.
Yeah.
So it's like a roller coaster ride for these businesses, making it impossible to make any long-term investment decisions.
Yeah, it felt like every single day brought a new headline and a new twist to the story.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about how Mexico reacted to all of this. Mexico's president, Sheinbaum, initially planned to retaliate with tariffs of her own.
Well, yeah, I mean, can you blame her?
No, not really.
Yeah. However, she managed to negotiate a pause on those tariffs with Trump, which, kind of shows that sometimes direct communication, even when there are disagreements, can be more effective than just digging in your heels.
Yeah, it's not like Mexico just sat back and did nothing,
Right.
They actually ramped up their efforts to crack down on these cartels, deploying troops to the border and even extraditing cartel leaders to the U.S.
Sheinbaum also claimed that fentanyl seizures at the border had decreased significantly. And, these actions might not have been the sole reason for Trump's decision to pause the tariffs, but they do show Mexico taking some concrete steps to address the concerns he had raised.
It's a lot more complex of a situation than, just Mexico is bad, like some people might think.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's shift gears and see how Canada responded. Unlike Mexico, the relationship between Canada's Prime Minister Trudeau and Trump was, it was a bit more strained, to put it mildly.
Yeah. There were reports of a very tense phone call between the two leaders, and it apparently involved some strong language. So the diplomatic dynamics were definitely different compared to the U.S.-Mexico situation.
So while Mexico got a pause on the tariffs through negotiation, Canada took a more hardline stance initially. They immediately retaliated with tariffs of their own, targeting $21 billion worth of American goods. And they were even prepared to hit back even harder with a second wave of tariffs on another $87 billion worth of goods.
But then, like Mexico, they decided to suspend that second wave of tariffs. It was a tense standoff, but ultimately cooler heads prevailed, at least for the moment. But this doesn't mean everything went back to normal.
No, exactly. Remember Doug Ford, the premier of Ontario?
Yeah.
Well, even after the tariff pause was announced, he decided to slap a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the U.S. It's just like a good example of the lingering tension and uncertainty that these tariffs created, even after they were supposedly off the table. And Canadian businesses were understandably nervous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's step back for a moment and talk about the bigger economic picture. This back and forth with tariffs wasn't just a political game. It had real consequences.
Right.
A lot of economic indicators started flashing red. We saw declines in retail and manufacturing sales. People were spending less, and consumer confidence took a hit.
And, those aren't just like abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. That means families might be putting off vacations or businesses might be hesitant to hire new employees.
Economists were particularly worried about the impact on inflation,
Yeah.
rising prices for everyday goods. And if businesses have to pay more for imported materials, they might have to pass those costs on to consumers, which could lead to a decrease in overall economic growth and potentially even job losses.
Right.
The Yale University Budget Lab estimated that these tariffs could cost the average household around $1,600 in disposable income.
Wow. That's a pretty significant chunk of change.
Yeah.
That could be going towards like savings, investments, or just enjoying life a little more. So, while the stated goal of tariffs is often to protect these domestic industries, there's a real risk that they could end up hurting the very people they're supposed to help.
And that brings us to a question that came up a lot in the discussions we looked at, especially on Reddit. Who actually benefits from these tariffs? On the surface, it might seem like a lose-lose situation.
Yeah, I mean, everyone likes a good deal, right? And tariffs usually mean higher prices, but it's actually a bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah, so let's take the example of U.S. steel producers. When tariffs are placed on imported steel, it makes foreign steel more expensive, which could, in theory, give U.S. steelmakers a competitive edge.
So it's like they're getting a little protection from foreign competition.
Exactly.
But here's where things get complicated. Those supply chains we talked about earlier.
Right, exactly. Even if U.S. steelmakers benefit initially, they might still rely on imported components or materials that are now more expensive because of those same tariffs.
So it's like shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah.
You might be helping one part of the industry, but you're hurting another.
And we can't forget about retaliation, right? Other countries might respond with their own tariffs on U.S. goods, which could hurt those very same steel producers in export markets. Plus, if the overall economy slows down because of the trade war, even those industries initially protected by tariffs could end up suffering in the long run.
It's a delicate balancing act, and there are a lot of unintended consequences that can really ripple through the economy.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really shows you just how interconnected the global economy is and how actions in one country can have, like, far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, like a giant game of Jenga.
Oh, yeah.
You pull out one piece, and you just hope the whole tower doesn't come crashing down.
That's a really good analogy. And in this particular game, it seemed like President Trump was using tariffs as a way to, like, exert pressure and force these other countries to make concessions.
It's like a high-pressure negotiation tactic, but it also creates a lot of uncertainty and risk, right? Like, if these other countries just don't play along, things could easily escalate.
Right. And that's where the danger of a trade war really comes in. When countries start throwing up these barriers to trade, it can lead to, like, a spiral of retaliatory tariffs, higher prices for consumers, and ultimately, it just harms everyone involved.
Now, some people might argue that tariffs are a way to protect American jobs and industries, but is that really true?
It's a complicated question. While tariffs might provide some short-term benefits for certain industries, the overall impact on the economy tends to be negative.
And those higher prices we talked about earlier,
Right.
they hit consumers the hardest, don't they?
They do. So even if a few companies see a temporary boost, the average person just ends up paying more for their everyday goods.
Right.
And that can have, like, a ripple effect on the entire economy. It's important to remember that trade, when done fairly and strategically, can actually be a very good thing. It allows countries to specialize in what they do best, creating more efficiency, and ultimately making goods more affordable for everyone.
So tariffs might seem like a quick fix, but in the long run, they could really do a lot more harm than good. So, like, what are the alternatives? How can countries address unfair trade practices without resorting to these tactics?
Well, there are other avenues like strengthening international institutions,
Yeah.
such as the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Okay.
And the WTO provides a framework for resolving trade disputes and ensuring fair competition.
Hmm.
So instead of engaging in these like tit-for-tat tariff battles, countries could work together to find more collaborative solutions.
Yeah, so it's about recognizing that we're all part of this like global economy, and finding ways to cooperate and trade fairly benefits everyone in the long run. This brings us back to you, the listener. Have you noticed any price changes in the things you buy regularly?
Yeah. Are there any industries or companies you're invested in that might be affected by all of this? It's worth taking a moment to just think about how these global events might be impacting your own life.
You know what? I was at the grocery store the other day and I noticed the price of avocados had gone up quite a bit.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I'm wondering if it could be related to all these trade tensions.
It's entirely possible.
Uh,
Avocados are a global commodity,
yeah.
and disruptions in trade can definitely affect those prices. The more we understand these connections, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions, both as consumers and as citizens.
Yeah, it's not just about like understanding economics, it's about being aware of the bigger picture, how these global events are interconnected and how they can impact our lives in like unexpected ways.
It's about asking questions, staying informed, and engaging in these discussions. Your voice and your choices matter.
So as this whole trade saga continues to play out, we encourage you to stay tuned and keep learning. The more we understand these like complex dynamics, the better we'll be able to navigate them and advocate for policies that promote fairness, stability, and prosperity for everyone. So, okay, we've walked through this whole tariff thing, seen the strategies, the reactions, and the potential fallout. What really stands out to me is like how tariffs, which are supposed to be there to protect domestic industries, can sometimes just totally backfire.
Right.
And actually end up hurting those same industries. Not to mention like consumers too, right?
Yeah. It's kind of like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Yeah.
You might get some temporary relief, but those long-term consequences, those can be a lot worse.
Yeah.
And it really raises an important question. In a world where economies are just so interconnected, are tariffs even an effective tool anymore?
That's a good question. Like we were talking about earlier, supply chains these days, they weave this tangled web across the globe. So just slapping a tariff on one product might seem like a simple solution at first, but then it can ripple through that entire system, driving up costs and causing disruptions in ways that like you just can't predict.
Yeah, and it's not just the economic impact either, right? There's also a geopolitical dimension to all of this.
Right.
When countries start engaging in these tit-for-tat tariff battles, it can damage relationships, it erodes trust, and it makes it a lot harder to cooperate on other issues down the line.
So if tariffs aren't the answer, then what are the alternatives? How can countries address those legitimate concerns about unfair trade practices without resorting to these protectionist measures that could ultimately harm everyone?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Some people argue that we need to rethink the role of those international institutions like the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Okay.
Maybe it needs, more teeth, more enforcement power to really effectively address issues like intellectual property theft or currency manipulation.
So instead of countries going it alone and trying to like strong-arm each other, maybe we need a stronger global referee to make sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, it requires a shift in mindset, too. Instead of viewing trade as this zero-sum game where one country wins and the other loses, we need to focus on creating a more level playing field,
Yeah.
Where everyone can benefit from free and fair trade.
So it's more about cooperation over confrontation.
Yeah.
Finding that common ground and building a system that actually fosters global economic growth and stability.
Absolutely.
Not just short-term gains for a select few. I mean, it's a tall order, but I think it's definitely worth striving for.
Absolutely. And as you go about your day, as you hear those news stories about trade deals or tariffs or economic policies, I encourage you to, think critically, ask questions, and consider that bigger picture. What are those underlying motivations?
Yeah.
What are the potential consequences, both intended and unintended? And most importantly, what are the alternatives? What are those paths that lead to a more just and prosperous world for everyone?
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day headlines, but these issues have real-world implications for every single one of us. So stay informed, stay engaged, and, Remember, your voice and your choices, they really do matter.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive for today. We hope you found it informative and insightful, and maybe even sparked some new ideas. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions.
Thanks for listening.